300 Spartans did not defend against 10,000 Persians at the Battle of Thermopylae. In the blazing summer of 480 BC, the Greek city-state of Sparta was occupied with celebrating one of its most sacred annual festivals. The week-long holiday of Carnia, a tribute to Apollo Carneos, the god of flocks and herds. As part of this homage, the worshippers were forbidden to participate in a war of any kind, lest the bipolar god ruin their source of food for the next year. This normally wouldn't have been a problem, except the Persian king Xerxes I was on his way to seek revenge for his father, who tried invading Greece 10 years earlier, and he failed. But because of this festival, King Leonidas of Sparta was only able to muster up his personal guard of 300 soldiers to bring with him to defend. That and 4,000 other soldiers from different city-states, which movies tend to forget. And while that might have been more than enough for the extremely well-positioned Greek soldiers to defend against only 10,000 enemy Persians, this too is a myth. There were more like 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers there to face off with little Leonidas. They did defend themselves for 3 days of battle, 7 in total. They did get betrayed by a countryman who led Xerxes down a back road through the mountains, and they did have a last stand where everyone died, except it was 1,500 people, not 300. But in the end, I suppose painting 6-pack abs and 1,500 actors may have been a tad too far out of budget for Zack Snyder's cult classic film. So, Germany started World War I. For more than 100 years, that's the story we've grown up hearing. School textbooks, Hollywood movies, and even the Treaty of Versailles reinforced it through the infamous War Guilt Clause, which placed primary responsibility for the conflict on Germany. But the reality is a lot messier. World War I was not caused by one country alone, it was the result of a massive web of alliances, secret agreements, imperial rivalries, nationalism, and dangerously rigid military mobilization plans that turned a regional conflict into a global catastrophe. Europe before 1914 was basically a geopolitical powder keg. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip triggered the initial crisis. Princip was linked to extremist Serbian nationalist networks, including connections to the Black Hand. In response, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. That should have remained a localized conflict. Instead, Europe's alliance system dragged the continent into chaos. Russia mobilized in support of Serbia, fully aware that large-scale mobilization would likely provoke war with Germany. France, still bitter over its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, strongly backed Russia and encouraged resistance against Germany. Meanwhile, Britain maintained unofficial commitments to France while publicly presenting itself as neutral for much of the crisis. Germany absolutely bears major responsibility as well. Wilhelm II and the German government gave Austria-Hungary the infamous blank check, guarantee of support, encouraging aggressive action against Serbia. Germany also escalated the conflict dramatically by invading neutral Belgium as part of the Schlieffen Plan, which brought Britain fully into the war. Those decisions were reckless and hugely consequential. But the idea that Germany alone, or Kaiser Wilhelm personally, single-handedly started World War I oversimplifies an incredibly complex situation. The major European powers all contributed to the disaster through militarism, imperial competition, alliance obligations, political miscalculations, and escalating nationalism. After the war ended, however, the victorious Allies had strong political reasons to place the majority of the blame on Germany. Doing so helped justify the harsh penalties imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. In other words, the popular narrative of Germany alone caused World War I was not just history, it was also wartime and post-war propaganda. The truth is that Europe essentially sleepwalked into catastrophe together. Rats spread the Black Death. For centuries, people have blamed rats for spreading the Black Death, the devastating pandemic that wiped out roughly a third of Europe's population during the 14th century. But modern research suggests the story may not be that simple. A study conducted by researchers at University of Oslo found that the plague may have spread more efficiently through human parasites, specifically fleas and lice living on people, rather than primarily through rats. The traditional explanation argues that infected rat fleas transmitted the disease to humans. And while rats likely did play some role, researchers discovered that historical death patterns across Europe did not perfectly match how rat-based outbreaks normally spread. Instead, when scientists compared different transmission models, the version involving human-to-human spread through parasites aligned much more closely with the actual historical mortality rates recorded during the pandemic. In other words, the real drivers of the Black Death may not have been swarms of infected rats crawling through medieval streets, but rather fleas and lice hitching rides directly on humans themselves. Considering the overcrowded cities, poor hygiene, and lack of medical knowledge in medieval Europe, that theory makes a disturbing amount of sense. So, while rats have become the iconic villains of one of history's deadliest pandemics, modern evidence suggests humanity may have been carrying the problem around on its own bodies the entire time. Women burned their bras as the Miss America protest in 1969. Feminism in the late 1960s gave rise to one of the era's most endearing images. Women supposedly burning bras like they were sacrificing Victoria's Secrets to the gods of equality. The story became a defining symbol of second-wave feminism. There is just one small problem: it probably never happened. The myth comes from the famous 1968 protest against the Miss America 1969 pageant in Atlantic City. Around 200 feminists and civil rights activists gathered outside the event to protest what they saw as ridiculous beauty standards, consumerism, sexism, and the general societal expectation that women should spend 14 hours a day pretending to naturally look like beauty queens. The protest was organized by the feminist group New York Radical Women, and honestly, they knew how to make a scene. The protesters carried signs, crowned a live sheep as Miss America, and tossed symbolic items into something called the Freedom Trash Can. Inside went bras, girdles, corsets, makeup, high heels, hairspray, false eyelashes, copies of Playboy, and basically every object associated with forced femininity. Imagine a very angry yard sale. Now, the myth began when the organizers originally wanted to burn the contents of the trash can as a symbolic protest. But according to several people involved, the police shut that idea down because setting random fires on a crowded wooden boardwalk was apparently frowned upon. Probably for the best. So instead, the items were simply thrown away. But shortly afterward, journalist Lindsay Van Gelder compared the protest to anti-war demonstrators burning draft cards during the Vietnam War. Newspapers quickly latched onto the phrase, bra burners, and suddenly the entire feminist movement got rebranded like some kind of lingerie-themed pyromaniac cult. The media absolutely loved it. And to be fair, there is some disagreement about whether a few items may have briefly caught fire during the protest. One local newspaper claimed some lingerie was burned for a short time before the flames were extinguished. However, the majority of organizers and participants insisted that no dramatic bra-burning bonfire ever occurred. But by then, it didn't matter. The image had already become legend. And honestly, that legend stuck around because it was useful to critics of feminism. Bra-burning feminism became an easy stereotype, one that made activists seem irrational, overly emotional, or ridiculous rather than focusing on what they were actually protesting. Which is kind of ironic because the real protest was less about underwear and more about how women were judged almost entirely on appearance, youth, and marketability. So no, the feminists at the Miss America protest probably did not spend the evening roasting bras over an open flame, but the media story burned so brightly that people still believe it more than 50 years later. Gladiators fought to the death. Contrary to what movies and pop culture love to portray, gladiator combat in the Colosseum was not designed as non-stop death matches. Because if every single fight ended up with someone getting turned into Roman ground beef, the empire would have been burned through gladiators ridiculously fast. The Colosseum operated for more than 4 centuries and hosted all kinds of massive public spectacles. Gladiator contests were the main attraction, but audiences also came for public executions, animal hunts, and even at its peak, they staged naval battles where the entire arena was flooded with water, which is honestly an absurd level of commitment to entertainment. And in many ways, gladiator combat functioned like the Roman version of modern MMA or boxing. Except, instead of gloves and octagon sponsorships, you had swords, spears, shields, and a very real possibility of losing a kidney. These weren't random street fights, they were organized sporting events, and successful gladiators became genuine celebrities. Some were battle-hardened veterans with huge fan followings, while others were inexperienced newcomers trying to make a name for themselves. And although many gladiators were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war hoping to earn freedom, others joined voluntarily, chasing wealth, fame, or simply the thrill of legally stabbing someone in front of tens of thousands of screaming spectators. Roman crowds absolutely ate that stuff up. Also, gladiators were far more diverse than the generic guy with sword and shield Hollywood usually gives us. Historians believe there were roughly 30 different gladiator types, each with specialized armor, weapons, and fighting techniques. You had the heavily armored Murmillo, the net and trident wielding Retiarius, the strange Andebite fighters with enclosed helmets, the savage Cestus fighters, and a whole roster of other oddly specific human DLC characters. Now, imagine you're some bored Roman citizen lounging around your house, scratching your behind, when suddenly people start talking about the biggest gladiator showdown of the year. Two Andebite fighting each other in the arena. Why would that be exciting? Because Andebite basically fought blind. These fighters, often condemned criminals, wore sealed helmets that severely limited their vision, then got tossed into the arena and told to start swinging weapons at each other while the crowd lost its collective mind. It was essentially two blindfolded men trying to beat each other to death with sharp metal objects. So yes, gladiator combat was undeniably dangerous, people absolutely died, but formal matches were generally not meant to end in death every single time. Fighters often succumbed to injuries after battles, but referees frequently intervened before lethal finishing blows could happen. Yep, ancient Rome had referees. These officials were usually retired gladiators, responsible for enforcing rules, controlling the pace of combat, and preventing fights from becoming unnecessarily fatal. And financially, that made perfect sense. Training gladiators was expensive, owners didn't want their star fighters dying every weekend and having to level up a brand new rookie from scratch. So despite Hollywood's obsession with constant bloodbaths, professional gladiator combat was mostly about spectacle, athleticism, and crowd entertainment, not guaranteed slaughter. And well, that's the end of the video. Hope you learned something new. Want to see a part 2? Let me know in the comments.